The Bible, as you so well know, can be brutally honest. It can be raw, it can be real, it can be honest. And such is the case here with the 22nd Psalm. This psalmist is brutally honest about his feelings about God. He feels that God has greatly let him down. He is deeply spiritually disillusioned, and he minces no words about it when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the cries of my anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night, but I find no rest in you. And friends, this is no mild-mannered complaint. This is a full-blown spiritual meltdown. The psalmist does not believe that God can be trusted in his moments of need. Well, let's glean some truths from this 22nd Psalm. First of all, this. In the right circumstances, any one of us can feel like the psalmist. In the right circumstances of our lives, any one of us can feel like the psalmist. Now, if you're here this morning and you're thinking to yourself, well, my faith is so deep, my faith is so strong that I would never, ever become that spiritually disillusioned. I would never, ever feel like God had betrayed me or let me down. I certainly would never feel like God had abandoned me. My faith is just too strong. Well, if you're thinking that or feeling that this morning, then I need to tell you as kindly as possible, you're a better person than Jesus. Because on the cross, as you so well know, in the midst of deep suffering and pain, Jesus cried out these words of the 22nd Psalm. Those weren't words original with Jesus. He picked that psalm while suffering on the cross. Think about it. As a Hebrew child, he had learned numerous psalms. He had memorized many verses in the Psalms. And so while suffering on the cross, he could have picked any psalm. He could have picked any verse of any psalm to cry out, but instead he chose the words of the 22nd Psalm, my God, why have you abandoned me? Jesus. Mother Teresa died in 1997, as most of you know. After her death, some letters that she had written to dear friends, close friends, and some spiritual confidants were shared with the public. Mother Teresa herself said these letters could not be shared until after her death because of what they revealed. And what they revealed amazingly was the spiritual despair that Mother Teresa often felt in her life, the spiritual disillusionment that she felt in her life that were only expressed to these personal friends, to these spiritual confidants. For example, she wrote, Mother Teresa, I am told that God lives in me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul. I want God with all the power of my soul, and yet between us, between her and God, there is a terrible separation. Heaven from every side is closed to me. I feel just the terrible pain of loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing. Listen to me. There is not a one of us in this sanctuary who can honestly say that we would never, ever be that spiritually disillusioned. It can happen to any of us. And it happens, secondly, because of the circumstances of life. How brutal and harsh and horrific and painful sometimes life can be. One of my favorite people, as an example, is Jane Goodall. I just adore Jane Goodall. She's 81 years old this year, as you may know. She really is one of God's marvelous caretakers of his animal kingdom. Don't you just love Jane Goodall? I mentioned before her autobiography, which is titled Reason to Hope. In that autobiography, she tells about how her own faith, her own deep faith, was greatly diminished by the painful suffering of her husband and his ultimate death. She writes this, and this is revealing. Let me tell you what Derek and I went through, Derek, her husband. The gradual increase of intense pain, the injections at night instead of the pills. Oh, the horror of it. Hell on earth. Suffering for the suffering of one I loved every more deeply with each passing day. The misery, the anguish, the hoping, praying, desperately seeking a way to cope, praying. I was haunted by the last words that Derek spoke before he died. I didn't know such pain was possible. I was grieving, suffering, and angry at God, at fate, the unjustness of it all. And so for a while after Derek's death, I rejected God. This is a woman of faith. And yet this is a woman who saw such suffering in the life of her husband for an extended period of time as he battled cancer that she readily admitted she was angry at God and angry at the unjustness of it all, that anyone should suffer such. Or take the witness of Holly Burkhalter. I invite you to read her book. It's an interesting book and a challenging book. It's titled, listen to this title, Good God, Lousy World in Me. Holly Burkhalter worked for the International Justice Organization. Her job for many years was to go to the hotbeds of violence in this world and catalog or record the injustices that occurred. Places like the Sudan and many other places where there's so many horrific things happening by human beings one on another. So her job was to go to the hotbeds of the world and record the great injustices that were being done by humanity on humanity. And she writes that the turning point for her was Rwanda. Remember Rwanda? We should never forget Rwanda. In 1994, in Rwanda, the Hutus attacked the Tutsis, and let this sink in 80 days, killed 800,000 men, women, and children, the vast majority hacked to death by machetes. She watched that. She saw the after effect of that, and so she writes in her book about that genocide, and it was genocide. This genocide, like the Holocaust before it, blew up the way we thought about the world and God's place in it. For me, it was the ultimate evidence that God was either dead, weak, or couldn't have cared less. No sovereign, loving God would have watched passively while fathers, mothers, babies, toddlers, and grandparents were dispatched with clubs and machetes ruthlessly. I was sick with fury. To me, believing in God was foolish. There can be moments in our lives of such intense pain and suffering. There can be moments when we look upon the world and see the horrific injustice that humanity does upon humanity and have some push against our faith, some diminishing of our spiritual security. Any of us. It's like Fantine sings in Les Miserables. I had a dream my life would be so different from this hell I'm living, so different now from what it seemed. My life has killed the dream I dreamed. Any of us. But thankfully, God understands our moments of spiritual struggle. You see, God made us the way we are. I've talked about this often. God made you a human being and not a spiritual robot. He made me a human being and not a spiritual robot. When He made us as people who have thoughts and feelings and expressions and moods and emotions. He knew that about you and about me. He knew the minute He made us as real life human beings that we would express those feelings and those emotions and those thoughts depending on how things were going in our life, simply because we're human. And He made us that way, didn't He? He understands. One of the real issues that's before the church nowadays that I've talked about before is millennial religion. And the millennials, upper young adults, as you know, are really raising questions about the faith. And they're raising questions that many church folks don't want to hear. And we're seeing the spillover of the millennial faith over into upper adolescence. And so there is a lot of work being done on how do you deal with the millennial generation? How do you deal with those who continue to raise question after question after question and who are relentless in their challenge to fundamental Christian faith. Well, one of the premier writers in this field is a woman named Kendra Creasy Dean. And if you're a parent or a grandparent of an adolescent or a young adult, you ought to write her name down. Kendra Creasy Dean. She's a United Methodist pastor. She teaches at Princeton Theological Seminary, and she has written much about how parents handle questioning young adults. So, for example, she says, always be supportive of your teenage children, even if you do not support everything they believe or do. She says, don't tell adolescents their beliefs are wrong. Support their exploration without fearing or discounting their discoveries. Forgive yourself, she says, if you find that you and your young adult children are on different pages about faith. And she says, do your best as a parent to share the faith and let God do the converting. Just because some young people reject God doesn't mean God has rejected them. What I like about what Kendra Creasy Dean has done, she's advised us parents and grandparents to cool it, to understand, to be patient, to realize that people can go through seasons of questioning, and we do no good by slamming the door shut when people question. Thanks be to God, He does not slam the door shut in my weaker moments. Thanks be to God that He does not slam the door shut when you have questions, when your faith wanes a bit, when the struggles come. Thanks be to God, He never slams the door against our railing against belief. Which leads to this final thought in the psalm. While we may disconnect from God, God will never disconnect from us. Now keep in mind the psalmist begins with a rant and rail against God. My God, why have you forsaken me? I cry to you by night and you do not come. I call you by day and you're not here. My God, why have you abandoned me? That's where he begins. But listen to where he ends. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Now that is good. From my mother's womb you have been my God. When I glorified you and when I embarrassed you, you remained my God. When my faith was solid as a rock and when my faith was swept away with the waves of life, you were still my God. When I could stand strong in the faith for everybody to see, and when my knees buckled with the weight of life and I questioned, you were still my God. From my mother's womb. And every moment of every day along the journey, said the psalmist, you really have been my God. A lot to learn here in this memorable psalm. Keep in mind that all of us, each and every one of us, can have seasons of spiritual disillusionment. Because life can bring such pain and such suffering and such horrendous actions that we can't help but find our faith struggling a bit. God understands that. He made us human. And He will always be our God. Thanks be to God. Amen.